When old Hendrik Visser passed away on a frost-bitten morning in late October, the whole township of New Friesland, Michigan, turned out for the funeral. Dutch flags hung at half-mast outside the Reformed church his great-grandfather had helped build in 1911, and the ladies of the congregation laid out enough coffee-edible pastries to feed 3 farms. Everyone agreed that Hendrik had lived a full life, 91 years of it spent on the same 240 acres his family had cleared from hardwood forest 4 generations earlier. What no one agreed on, once the will was read 3 days later in the back office of Steketee & Sons law firm, was whether the old man had lost his mind before he died. Hendrik had 2 grandchildren left to carry his name into the future, since his only son and daughter-in-law had died in a car accident on Highway 31 back in 2004. Peter Visser, 34, had never left the farm. He drove the same green tractor his grandfather taught him on, married a local girl named Carol, and by all appearances, was the natural heir. His younger sister Greta had gone away to Michigan State University to study horticulture, then further still, working 2 seasons at a research vineyard in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, before coming home when Hendrik's health began to fail. She was the one who changed his bandages and drove him to dialysis. Peter was the one who kept the equipment running and the crops in the ground. Both grandchildren, in their own way, had earned something. But the will did not read the way most people expected. To my grandson Peter, I leave the barn, the equipment shed, the dairy parlor, and the 160 acres of bottomland along Rabbit Creek. To my granddaughter Greta, I leave the 80 acres of the East Ridge, together with whatever she can make of the stones. There was a silence in that office long enough that the attorney, a heavy-set man named Lawrence Steketee, whose own father had drawn up half the wills in that township, finally cleared his throat and asked if anyone needed water. Carol's face had already gone tight and pale. Peter just stared at the paper, as if reading it twice might change the words on it. Only Greta seemed unsurprised, which everyone in the room found strange at the time, and would find far stranger 3 years later, once they understood why. That last line, "Whatever she can make of the stones," was the one the whole township repeated at the diner counter for months afterward, usually with a chuckle. Everybody in New Friesland knew the East Ridge. It was the strip of high ground that ran along the edge of the property, a glacial moraine left behind roughly 14,000 years ago when the Laurentide ice sheet dragged boulders, gravel, and clay down from the Canadian Shield and dumped them in irregular ridges as it melted back north. 3 generations of Vissers had tried to farm that ridge and failed. The soil was thin, studded with fieldstone the size of bowling balls, and it drained so fast that corn planted there in a dry July would curl and yellow, while the bottomland corn stood shoulder-high and green. Hendrik himself used to joke that the East Ridge had grown nothing but rocks and regret since 1887. Peter, for his part, tried to be gracious about it in front of the family, though Carol was overheard at the funeral luncheon saying that her father-in-law must have been confused by the end, giving away a working dairy barn's worth of land to a woman who hadn't touched a milking machine in 15 years, while handing his granddaughter a pile of glacial rubble. Greta said nothing. She drove out to the East Ridge 2 days after the will was read, alone, and walked the entire 80 acres on foot with a soil probe and a notebook, the way she had been trained to do at both Michigan State and in Oregon. She was out there past sunset, and when her husband finally called her cell phone worried sick, she told him something that made him drive out with a thermos of coffee instead of insisting she come home. "Mark," she said, "I think Grandpa Hendrik knew exactly what he was doing." To understand why, you have to understand what most row crop farmers overlook about rocky, well-drained ridge ground, and what winemakers have known for centuries. Grapevines, unlike corn or soybeans, do not want rich, deep, moisture-holding soil. A vine planted in fat black bottomland soil will throw enormous amounts of leafy green growth and produce watery, flavorless fruit, because the plant puts its energy into leaves and shoots instead of sugar and flavor compounds in the berries. What premium wine grapes actually crave is stress. Poor, rocky mineral soil that drains fast and forces the roots to dig 10 or 20 feet down in search of water produces smaller, more concentrated berries, thicker skins, and deeper flavor, the very quality that the French call terroir, the taste of a specific place transmitted through struggle. The gravel and stone that had frustrated 3 generations of Visser corn farmers were, in the world of viticulture, close to gold. There was a second advantage that Greta had learned to spot from her time in Oregon, one that has nothing to do with soil chemistry and everything to do with basic physics. Cold air is denser than warm air, so on a still, clear spring night, cold air sinks and pools in low ground while it drains away from high ground, the same way water runs downhill. Farmers call this cold air drainage. The bottomland along Rabbit Creek, the very ground everyone assumed was the prize, sat in exactly the kind of low frost pocket where a late April freeze could kill tender new growth overnight. The East Ridge, 80 feet higher in elevation, would almost always stay a few degrees warmer on those same nights, because the cold air simply slid off it and pooled below. In grape growing, where a single hard frost after bud break can wipe out an entire year's crop, that handful of degrees is the difference between a harvest and a disaster. Greta also knew something else that most of her neighbors did not, because it had only become widely available to Midwest growers in the 2 decades before Hendrik's death. For most of American history, wine grapes belonged to California, Oregon, and Washington, because the classic European vinifera varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay could not survive a Michigan or Minnesota winter. Plant breeders at the University of Minnesota had spent decades crossing vinifera grapes with cold-hardy Native American species to produce new hybrid varieties, most famously Marquette and Frontenac, grapes that could survive temperatures down to nearly negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit and still ripen a full-flavored, food-grade wine grape in a short Midwestern season. These varieties were still fairly new to most local farmers in the 2010s, treated as a novelty rather than a serious commercial crop. Greta had watched them succeed in Oregon nursery trials and knew exactly which rootstock and spacing would work on a rocky glacial ridge. She spent that winter doing something her brother found almost insulting in its modesty. She did not buy new equipment, did not take out a large loan, and did not tell anyone in town what she was planning. She and Mark cleared 4 acres by hand and machine, working weekends, pulling stone by the truckload, and using the biggest field stones to build low terrace walls that would later double as heat sinks, absorbing daytime sun and releasing warmth to the vines overnight, an old trick borrowed from European hillside vineyards going back to the Romans. She planted her first 4 acres of Marquette and Frontenac Grise in the spring, spacing the rows for air movement to reduce fungal disease, and undersowed the rows with a mix of clover and fescue instead of bare cultivated soil. The clover was not decoration. As a legume, clover hosts colonies of rhizobium bacteria in nodules on its roots that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and fix it into the soil in a form plants can use, feeding the vineyard's soil for free, while the fescue's fibrous roots held the thin topsoil in place against erosion on the slope. Below both, an unseen network of mycorrhizal fungi wrapped around the vine roots, extending their effective reach for water and phosphorus far beyond what the roots could manage alone, and partnership between fungus and plant that most row crop soils, tilled and sprayed year after year, had long since lost. Back on the bottomland, Peter kept doing what a Visser had always done: corn one year, soybeans the next, in a strict 2-year rotation, chasing yield the way every extension bulletin and seed dealer told him to. For the first 2 years after Hendrik's death, it looked like Peter had gotten the better end of the will by a mile. His combine rolled in every fall with 200-bushel corn, his dairy parlor still shipped milk twice a week, and Greta's little vineyard, not even old enough to produce a full crop, looked to the neighbors like an expensive hobby for a woman who had spent too many years around Oregon wine snobs. But 2 problems were quietly building underneath Peter's success, the kind of problems that do not show up until they compound. The first was biological. Continuous corn and soybean rotation on the same ground, year after year, is exactly the environment that soybean cyst nematode thrives in, a microscopic roundworm that attacks soybean roots and can cut yields by 15 to 30% before a farmer even notices symptoms above ground, since the plants simply look a little stunted and yellow rather than obviously diseased. Peter had never rotated in a third crop or a cover crop to break the nematode's life cycle, because a third crop meant new equipment, new markets, and lower short-term yield, none of which fit the operation Hendrik had built. The second problem was financial, and it was the one that actually sank him. Peter had taken out a loan in his second year to upgrade to a larger GPS-guided planter and a second combine head, betting on corn prices holding above $4 a bushel. When commodity prices slid through 2015 and 2016, the way row crop prices had slid in painful cycles for 100 years before that, Peter's fixed loan payments did not slide down with them. He was locked into equipment payments calculated for boom year income in a bust year market on soil that was quietly yielding less every season because of the nematode buildup he never tested for. By the start of his third year without his grandfather, Peter was doing what a lot of proud farmers do when the numbers stop working. He was refinancing to cover the last loan, telling Carol it was a temporary rough patch, and telling himself the same thing every spring when he planted corn into ground that was giving him less and less reason to believe it. Greta's 4 acres, meanwhile, crossed the threshold that every vineyard consultant will tell you to expect, and that most impatient first-time growers do not want to hear. Grapevines typically need 3 full growing seasons before they produce a commercially meaningful harvest, because the plant spends its first year establishing roots, its second building a permanent trunk and cordon structure, and only in its third year does it have enough stored energy to ripen a real crop of fruit without stunting its own future growth. Exactly 3 years after she planted, in the same autumn that Peter's second refinance came due, Greta harvested her first full crop off those 4 rocky acres, hand-picked into lug boxes on a cool October morning, with frost already silvering the grass in the low bottomland below her, and none at all up on her ridge. She had partnered 18 months earlier with a small custom crush facility 2 counties over, the kind of shared winemaking space that has let small growers across the Midwest bottle their own label without the enormous capital cost of building a winery from scratch. Her first vintage, a bright cherry and cranberry-toned Marquette with the kind of firm acidity that food and wine writers had started calling the hidden strength of cold climate reds, sold out its 400 cases in 11 weeks, most of it through a farm stand she and Mark had built from reclaimed barnwood, right at the edge of the East Ridge, where visitors driving the county's new wine trail could see both the vines and, across the valley, her brother's flat green bottomland. Word got around New Friesland the way it always does, first as gossip at the diner, then as genuine respect once people tasted the wine at the township's Sinterklaas market that December. The stones nobody wanted, it turned out, made a wine nobody expected. And the rich bottomland everybody had envied was, by the following spring, listed with a farm realty agency out of Grand Rapids, 160 acres, barn, dairy parlor, and equipment shed included, foreclosure sale, subject to bank approval. Peter told Greta himself, over coffee at her farm stand, of all places, the one conversation the two of them had managed since the funeral that did not turn into an argument about the will. He was not bitter anymore, or if he was, he hid it well. He told her their grandfather used to say something he had never fully understood until that year, that a farm does not fail because the land is bad. It fails because a family keeps asking the land to be something it was never built to be. Hendrik had farmed that bottomland his whole life and loved it. But Hendrik had also walked the East Ridge as a boy, watched the frost settle in the valley and skip the high ground, and never forgotten it. Greta did not buy the whole 160 acres. She could not have afforded it, and she did not want to be the sister who profited off her brother's ruin, a story the whole township would have gladly told for another 20 years. Instead, she and Mark worked out a private arrangement with the bank and with Peter directly. She bought the 20 acres of gentle, well-drained slope closest to her existing vineyard, ground good enough for a second block of vines, and left the deep bottomland to be sold to a neighboring dairy operation that could actually use flat ground for silage corn without asking it to be a vineyard. Peter and Carol used what was left after the sale to pay off the remaining debt clean, with a little left over, and Peter took a job managing operations for the very dairy that bought his old bottomland, a job that let him keep working land he knew without carrying the weight of ownership that had nearly buried him. The barn still stands on what used to be the Visser home place, repainted red by its new owners, still visible from the East Ridge if you know where to look. Greta kept one thing from it before the sale closed, the old hand-forged weather vane shaped like a running horse that had topped the barn since 1911, the same one Hendrik used to point to and tell his grandchildren which way the weather was coming from. It sits now on the peak of her tasting room roof, turning quietly above rows of vines growing out of the very stones her grandfather left her, on a ridge that never grew a decent ear of corn in 130 years, and never needed to. Every October when Greta walks her rows before harvest, she still finds a fieldstone or two working its way up out of the thawed and refrozen ground. The same slow geological process, called frost heave, that has been pushing stones toward the surface since the glaciers first laid them down. As repeated freezing and thawing of soil water lifts buried rock a fraction of an inch higher every winter. She used to see it as a chore. Now she just adds each one to the terrace wall and lets it hold the day's heat a little longer into the cold Michigan night, doing exactly what her grandfather always knew it could. Peter comes by most Sunday afternoons now, after church, the way the two of them used to as kids, before either barn or ridge belonged to anybody. He brings his and Carol's two boys, and the older one, 8 years old and already fascinated with the terrace walls, likes to help Greta sort fieldstone by size, the way she taught him. The big ones for the base of the wall, the flat ones for capping it smooth. Peter still manages the dairy herd 2 miles down the road, and he tells anyone who asks that it suits him better than ownership ever did, that there is a particular kind of peace in doing good work on land you do not have to lie awake worrying about losing. He and Greta do not talk much about the will anymore. They do not need to. What people in New Friesland tell newcomers now, when they drive them past the old Visser barn on the way to the wine trail, is not really a story about rocks or barns at all, whatever the title on the roadside sign might suggest. It is a story about reading the land honestly, instead of wishing it into being something it is not. About a grandfather who spent 91 years learning the difference between rich ground and good ground, and who left each of his grandchildren exactly what he believed they were suited to make something of. Hendrik Visser never got to taste his granddaughter's wine, but there is a bottle of that first vintage still resting, unopened, in the cool stone cellar beneath the tasting room, a bottle Greta has promised herself she will only open the day her own grandchild asks her, the way she once asked her grandfather what in the world anyone could ever do with a ridge full of rocks.